Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to dig into some fascinating developments between Canada and the US.
Uh,
Got this fresh Fox News article about Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau heading to Florida
hmm,
to meet with President-elect Trump.
interesting.
It's at Mar-a-Lago, of all places.
Hmm.
And it comes right after Trump threatened those big tariffs on Canadian goods, remember? 25%.
Yes, quite a significant move. And the timing of the visit does raise some eyebrows, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting to see Trudeau taking this step despite that threat.
Yeah, especially because Trump tied those tariffs to concerns about illegal immigration and drug trafficking.
Right, from Canada and Mexico, he's been saying.
Makes you wonder what Trudeau's thinking here. It's not like this is Trump's first tariff rodeo, right?
Definitely not. We
Mhm.
saw those tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum during his first term,
Oh, yeah.
and Canada hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
It was a whole trade war thing, wasn't it?
It was. And if they slap a 25% tariff on Canadian goods this time, could have some big consequences. For both countries, I'd imagine. For consumers, especially.
Right.
Think about the impact on grocery prices, for example.
It's kind of ironic
Yeah.
because Trudeau pointed out that Trump campaigned on, actually lowering those costs.
Hmm. Quite a contrast there.
It is. So Trudeau being the first G7 leader to visit Trump since the election.
Especially with this whole tariff thing hanging over their heads.
Yeah, what do you make of that?
Well, it shows he's willing to engage directly with Trump, despite, the potential for conflict. It could be a sign of his diplomatic style. Maybe he's trying to build a personal connection.
Could be. And then there's the choice of Mar-a-Lago as the venue. Adds another layer, don't you think?
It does. Meeting on Trump's home turf.
Yeah. What do you think that signals?
It's open to interpretation, isn't it? Some might see it as a show of respect,
Okay.
a way to maybe appeal to Trump personally, or even a subtle way to highlight how important the U.S.-Canada relationship is. What are your thoughts?
Hmm. Hard to say for sure. Definitely adds to the intrigue, though. And speaking of the bigger picture, that article really emphasized how crucial Canada is to the U.S. as a trading partner. Biggest foreign supplier for a bunch of stuff, steel, aluminum, uranium.
Right.
And they're a major source of oil and electricity, too.
Absolutely. The economic ties between those two are huge,
Yeah.
especially when you look at the energy sector.
A trade war would.
Oh, definitely have consequences
Mm.
for both sides. Could really disrupt some vital supply chains.
They're kind of joined at the hip, aren't they? In a lot of ways.
You could say that. The potential fallout from a serious trade dispute, it's something neither country would likely want to deal with.
Right. And then there's Mexico.
Yes.
Trump's threatened them with similar tariffs, citing migration concerns, of course. And we just saw Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo.
Agreed to help curb migration to the U.S. during that phone call with Trump.
Yeah, it really brings the whole immigration issue to the forefront. How it's shaping U.S. foreign policy.
It does. And it makes you compare how the U.S. handles its relationships with Canada and Mexico.
Yeah.
How they're similar, how they're different.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Will Mexico still face pressure even after agreeing to cooperate on migration?
It's certainly a possibility. We've seen Trump take a pretty hard stance on these issues in the past. Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, a lot at stake here. When you consider how vital Canada is to U.S. energy and national security, I mean, what kind of leverage does Trudeau actually have going into these negotiations?
That's a key point. It's not just about trade. Their strategic importance does give them some leverage. They can remind the U.S., for instance, that a trade war would hurt both sides and potentially disrupt those vital supply chains, as we talked about.
So we've got this complex mix of economics and geopolitics. What are the potential risks and rewards for Trudeau meeting with Trump at Mar-a-Lago like this?
Well, the risk is that he could be seen as giving in to Trump's demands or appearing weak on the world stage.
Especially with his own voters to think about, right?
Exactly. But then there's the potential reward. A face-to-face meeting could be a chance to build some kind of personal relationship with Trump, maybe ease the tension, lay the groundwork for a more positive relationship.
It's a high-stakes game for sure. This meeting could set the tone for U.S.-Canada relations going forward. Where do you see things heading from here?
It's hard to say. We're in uncharted territory, really. The global landscape is changing. Alliances are being tested. The outcome of this meeting could have effects beyond just Canada and the U.S.
So it's bigger than just tariffs and trade, then?
I think so. It's about the future of global cooperation in a world that's increasingly interconnected.
Wow. A lot to think about. What's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is that We're at a turning point. The old rules might not apply anymore. It's crucial to stay informed, to think critically about what we're reading and hearing, and to really understand how these forces are shaping our world.
Couldn't agree more. Staying informed is so important, especially with all the information out there these days. But for now, we're going to have to leave you in suspense.
The story's far from over.
It is. This meeting at Mar-a-Lago could be a turning point, for better or for worse. We'll have to wait and see what develops in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. Keep
Yeah.
your eyes peeled.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating time to be following all this international stuff.
It is.
The whole situation. It really highlights how complicated global trade and diplomacy are these days.
Totally. Like watching a high-stakes chess match play out in real time. And speaking of strategy, I'm curious to hear more about what options Trudeau might have. What cards does he actually have to play in these negotiations?
That's a great question. It's easy to get caught up in just the economic side of things.
Right.
But as we talked about, Canada's role goes beyond just being a supplier for the U.S.
Yeah.
Their importance in energy and national security.
Gives them some leverage.
Exactly.
Can you give me a real-world example of how that might actually work?
Sure. Let's think about energy, for instance. Canada's a big supplier of crude oil and natural gas to the U.S.,
Right.
particularly to those Midwest and Northeast regions.
Yeah.
Now, imagine a trade war disrupts that flow of energy.
Oh, yeah.
Could have serious consequences for those areas, especially during winter.
That makes sense. So Trudeau could potentially soften the U.S. stance on those tariffs by
Potentially.
reminding them how interdependent they are.
Right. He could also highlight how Canada cooperates on other important issues.
Right.
Border security, defense, things like that.
Show them they're a valuable partner.
Exactly.
It sounds like he's walking a tightrope, though.
Oh, for sure.
Needs to stand up for Canada's interests, but also keep a good relationship with the U.S.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the domestic political pressures on both sides.
Oh, right.
Trudeau has his own people to answer to. Looking weak in the face of U.S. demands could hurt him politically.
It's true. We often focus on the international stuff, but...
Domestic politics play a huge role.
Yeah. Public opinion, media coverage, what different political parties are saying.
All of it factors in.
So how do you think this meeting at Mar-a-Lago will actually go? Think Trudeau can smooth things over with Trump?
It's tough to say. Trump can be unpredictable.
That's for sure.
He might take a hard line, push for Kennedy to give up a lot.
Or maybe that personal relationship they build during the meeting could sway him.
It's possible. We've seen him respond well to leaders who
appeal to him personally.
Yeah. But we can't forget that Trump's America First agenda is kind of at the core of his whole political identity.
Right.
It's like there's this clash between Trump's more protectionist, nationalist approach
Versus
the more globalist outlook of someone like Trudeau.
Yeah. So where does that leave us? If these two visions keep clashing, what does it mean for the future of international trade and global relations?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's something experts all over the world are trying to figure out. If protectionist measures become the norm, could see a decline in global trade, potentially hurt the global economy as a whole,
Yikes.
could create instability, make it harder to deal with shared challenges, climate change,
Yeah.
security threats, that sort of thing.
That sounds pretty worrying. Are there any potential upsides to this shift towards nationalism?
Some people argue that focusing on national interests could lead to trade deals that are more fair,
Okay.
could protect domestic industries from unfair competition, and maybe even reduce reliance on global supply chains, which we've seen can be fragile, especially lately.
So there are arguments on both sides. Sounds like we're at a real crossroads.
Yeah.
And the decisions leaders like Trump and Trudeau make.
They'll have big consequences for the future.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to why it's so important to be informed, to be engaged.
Right. Citizens need to understand these issues and hold their leaders accountable for the choices they make.
Yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed with how much information is out there, but
It's more crucial than ever to be careful about what news we consume, to seek out different perspectives.
couldn't agree more. Need to be able to critically evaluate the information we're seeing and form our own opinions. So, for our listener, what are the key things to watch for as this situation unfolds? What are the red flags?
I'd say pay attention to the rhetoric from both sides.
Okay.
Are their positions hardening? Or are there signs of compromise? A willingness to negotiate.
Got it.
And it's important to look beyond just the headlines. Think about the potential long-term effects of any actions either country
It's
takes.
like you said before, we need to think about the implications for
Not just Canada and the U.S.
but for the whole global order.
Exactly. This isn't just a bilateral issue. It has the potential to reshape how countries interact with each other on a global scale. We need to be aware of that and engage in these discussions in a thoughtful way,
A lot to process, but that's what the deep dive is all about.
giving you the knowledge and insights you need,
To navigate this complex world.
and hopefully spark some interesting conversations and debates along the way.
Definitely. We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. Let's take a second to recap the key takeaways before we move on to the final part of our discussion.
Sounds good.
Right.
I think the main thing to remember is that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is much more intricate than it might seem at first glance. It's not just about trade.
Right.
It's about energy, security, and these competing visions for the future of global order.
And we've seen how those different visions can create tension, uncertainty, like with this whole tariff situation.
Exactly. We've also talked about the leverage Canada might have in these negotiations, particularly when it comes to their role in U.S. energy and national security.
But as we've mentioned, there are also those domestic political factors that can influence how both leaders handle these situations.
The delicate balancing act
Ah,
for both Trudeau and Trump
for sure. And the results of this meeting at Mar-a-Lago,
could have a ripple effect,
not just for Canada and the U.S.,
but for the whole world.
So with that in mind, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore some possible scenarios for how this situation might unfold and talk about what you, our listener, can do to stay informed and engaged. Okay, so we've looked at how complicated things are between the U.S. and Canada, the possibility of a trade war, and what leverage Canada might have. Now let's put on our prediction hats for a minute. This Trudeau-Trump meeting at Mar-a-Lago, what are some ways it could go?
Well, one possibility is that everything goes smoothly.
Best case scenario.
Right. Trudeau and Trump, they hit it off, find some common ground, and they agree to back off from all those tariff threats. Maybe they work out a compromise on certain trade issues, or just agree to keep talking, but in a more...
constructive way.
That'd be great.
Mm.
What about a less optimistic scenario?
Sure.
What if things go south? The meeting ends with no progress.
That could definitely happen. If Trump refuses to budge, insists that Canada makes big concessions,
Could really escalate tensions. We might see those retaliatory tariffs. Communication could break down even further. And ultimately...
hurt the whole relationship between the two countries.
Exactly. It seems like it really comes down to whether Trump is willing to see Canada as a partner.
And not just a target for his America First agenda.
Right. Does he see this as a zero-sum game? Like if Canada wins, the U.S. loses.
Or can he see the benefits of working together?
Yeah.
It also makes me think about the other G7 leaders.
Mm.
If Canada's facing all this pressure from the U.S.,
Do you think other countries might step in?
yeah,
Yeah.
support Canada, maybe.
That's an interesting thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that other G7 leaders might try to,
Mediate.
or put pressure on Trump to back down.
Mm-hmm.
They might see this as a test case.
For how the U.S. is going to treat its allies under Trump.
Exactly. And they might worry about a domino effect, other countries becoming targets for these protectionist policies.
Yeah, the stakes are high, not just for Canada and the U.S., but for everyone.
Absolutely.
This meeting at Mar-a-Lago.
Could be a turning point for international relations.
Absolutely. And that's where you, our listener, come in.
You've learned a lot about this complex situation.
Now you have the tools to stay informed and engaged as things develop. So what can our listeners do to stay on top of this, make sense of what happens next?
The first thing I'd say is, get your information from different sources.
Don't just rely on one news outlet.
Right. Read articles from different places, listen to podcasts with various perspectives, talk to people who have different opinions.
Get a well-rounded view. Challenge your own assumptions.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to go deeper. If something grabs your attention, do some research. Follow those links. Explore the issues underneath. The more informed you are, the better you'll understand what's going on. And you can form your own conclusions.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Whatever happens at this meeting, it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The relationship between Canada and the U.S. and the whole global landscape, it's going to keep changing.
It's a story that's still being written, and we're all part of it by staying informed, asking questions, and talking about these things in a constructive way.
We can all play a role in shaping the future we want to see.
I like that.
That's a great note to end on. We've reached the end of our deep dive into U.S.-Canada relations.
We've covered a lot.
We have. Hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit fun.
It's been great exploring this with you.
Likewise. And to our listener, keep exploring, keep learning, and stay engaged with the world around you. Until next time, stay curious.